They said Sila's crow had drowned a boatful of men with his own hands, and that the sea had spat him back ashore scarred as a punishment for what he'd done. They said the burns on his face were the marks of the men who'd clawed at him as they went under. Children in the village of Penhallow believed it the way they believed in the tide, and grown men crossed the lane when his shadow fell across the cobbles. Everyone in that gray little fishing village kept their distance from the lighthouse on the rock. Everyone except a widow with a debt she couldn't pay, and nothing left in the world to lose. The Maine coast in the winter of 1897 was a place of black water and white wind, where the granite met the Atlantic in a fight that never ended. The village of Penhallow clung to a notch in the cliffs, a huddle of salt-bleached cottages and a single long cannery wharf, and out past the harbor mouth, on a slab of tidal rock that vanished twice a day beneath the sea, stood the Penhallow light. For 23-year-old Edith Marsh, the winter had become a slow drowning of its own kind. 8 months ago, her husband Thomas had gone out before dawn with 3 other men and never come back. They had brought his boat in 2 days later, swamped and empty, and they had buried an empty coffin because the sea had kept what it took. Thomas had been a good man, but a hopeful one, the sort who borrowed against a catch that hadn't been landed yet. He had owed money to the cannery, and the cannery in Penhallow was one man, and that man was Corwin Fitch. Fitch was the harbor master and the buyer of every fish that came ashore, and he held the village the way a fist holds sand. He had visited Edith's cottage 3 times since the funeral, and each time his condolences had grown a little colder and his arithmetic a little plainer. He wanted her cottage, and more than that, he wanted her berth on the wharf, the deep-water mooring Thomas had held by Old Wright, the one Fitch needed for the larger boats he meant to bring in. Edith couldn't pay the winter quota. She couldn't crew a boat, because no man in Penhallow would risk Fitch's blacklist to work for a doomed widow. She was, in every way the village could measure, finished. The constable, a soft, heavy man named Reuben Hatch, had ridden out to her gate that very week, ostensibly to ask after her health. But the message under his kindness had been clear enough. Sign the berth over to Mr. Fitch, Edith. Winter's hard on a woman alone. Don't make it ugly. She had stood at her cold hearth that night and watched the lighthouse blink its slow, patient warning across the black harbor, on and off, the only thing in Penhallow that didn't answer to Corwin Fitch. The town called the keeper a monster, but monsters were not afraid of other men, and Edith Marsh had run clean out of people who weren't. She saw him up close for the first time on a raw Thursday in the chandler's shop. She had come in to trade her last good wool blanket for lamp oil and a length of cod line, and the low murmur of the shop had died the instant the bell jangled and a shadow filled the doorway. Sila's crow had to stoop to come through it. He was a tall man made broader by an oilskin coat gone stiff with salt, and when he stepped inside the warm room he seemed to push the warmth out ahead of him. But it was not his size that made Walter Prout the chandler go pale behind his counter. It was his face. The right side was a hard, weathered, almost handsome thing, dark-bearded and sharp at the jaw. The left side was ruin, the skin pulled and gleaming where old fire had taken it, dragging the corner of his mouth into a permanent grimace, and his left ear was little more than a notch. He smelled of cold lamp oil and wood smoke and the sea. "Oil," Silas said. His voice was low and scraped like a keel dragged over shingle. "And tar, if you've it." Prout scrambled to fill the order, not meeting his eyes. The other 2 men in the shop had found sudden deep interest in the floorboards. And so, as Silas turned to wait, his gaze swept the room and stopped on Edith standing by the coils of rope, her thin shawl pulled tight. Every instinct she had told her to look at the floor like the rest of them. But Edith was tired. She was tired of grieving and tired of being pitied and tired most of all of being afraid. She held his eyes. The scarred man went still. He was not used plainly to being looked at, and for a long suffocating moment the widow and the lighthouse keeper regarded each other across the dusty shop, and in his eyes she did not find a monster. She found something she knew very well from her own wash-basin mirror, a deep and total loneliness. Then Prout shoved the oil and tar across the counter, and as Silas reached for them his stiff sleeve caught a small barrel of cork floats and tipped it. Without thinking, Edith lunged and caught it against her hip before it could spill across the floor. Silas stopped. He looked down at her, vast and dark as a coming squall, and the two men by the wall held their breath, waiting for the monster to roar to strike. Edith set the barrel back upright, her hands trembling a little under its weight, and looked up at him. "There," she said quietly. "No harm done." Silas's chest rose and fell. He leaned down a fraction and his ruined mouth worked. "Didn't ask for your help," he rasped. "And I didn't ask your leave to give it," Edith answered, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Silas stared at her a long moment, his jaw tight. Then without a word he gathered his oil and his tar, dropped 2 coins on the counter, and went back out into the wind, and the whole shop let out its breath at once behind him. That night Edith sat in the cold and did the arithmetic of her ruin one last time, and it came out the same as always. She needed a crew, and she had none. She needed money, and she had none. She needed someone who did not care what Corwin Fitch could do to a man, and there was exactly one such person within 40 miles of Penhallow, and he lived on a rock in the sea that the village swore was haunted. By morning she had stopped thinking of it as madness and started thinking of it as the only door left unlocked. She waited for the tide to draw back and bare the long-ribbed causeway of wet stone that joined the lighthouse rock to the shore twice a day. And then she went, a basket of her best mending over one arm, the wind shoving at her like a hand on her chest. The causeway was treacherous, slick with weed and pocked with pools, and she knew that if she lingered too long the returning tide would cut her off and the cold would have her before any soul came looking. But she kept on, and as she climbed the worn steps cut into the rock at the far end, a sound stopped her, a harsh, indignant shriek. A gull dropped onto the railing not 3 feet from her face and fixed her with one bright eye. Where its other eye should have been was only a pale, scarred socket. It screamed at her again, beat its wings, and did not fly. The village said the keeper kept a familiar, a one-eyed bird that carried the souls of the drowned. Standing there with her heart in her throat, Edith could almost believe it. Then the lighthouse door scraped open, and Silas's crow filled the frame, an oil can in one scarred hand and an expression of pure black annoyance on his face. "You're a long way from the village, Widow Marsh," he said. The gull screamed and hopped along the rail toward him, and without seeming to think about it he reached into his coat and tossed it a strip of dried fish, which it snatched from the air. Edith set down her basket on the step. "I've come to hire you, Mr. Crow," she said. He looked at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. "Hire me? I've a deep-water berth on the wharf and a sound boat, and not a single man in Penhallow brave enough to crew her, because they're all of them owned by Corwin Fitch. You aren't." Silas set the oil can down slowly. He came to the head of the steps and stood over her, and the wind whipped her dark hair across her face, and the ruined side of him was stark and terrible in the flat gray light. "And what makes you think," he said, "that I care a copper for you, your boat, or Corwin Fitch?" "I don't," Edith said. "But I've seen you counting coins at Prout's, same as me. I've nothing to pay you, but I've 2 good hands and a needle, and I'll mend every stitch of your gear that the salt has rotted, and come spring I'll give you 1/3 of every catch off that berth. It's a fair trade, and you know it." He stepped down toward her, closing the space until she could feel the heat coming off him in the cold, and she understood that he was waiting for her to flinch, to weep, to scramble back down the steps in horror the way the whole world always did. "You don't know the first thing about me," he said, very low. "They tell you stories down there. They say I drowned 4 men. They say I'm mad. They say I'm a monster." Edith lifted her chin and looked past the burns, past the gleaming scarred skin, straight into his eyes. "They do say you're a monster, Mr. Crow," she said softly. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers. "Maybe they're right." The gull screamed. The sea boomed against the rock below them. "I'm not afraid of you," Edith whispered, and the words struck him like a thrown stone. He froze. For one fleeting second the hard, brutal thing he wore over his face slipped, and underneath it she saw something raw and tired and terribly young. He searched her face for the lie and found none, only a quiet and stubborn calm. Silas straightened. He looked out past her over her shoulder to the village hunched in its notch across the water, its windows just beginning to glow against the dusk. He stood silent so long she thought he meant to simply turn and shut the door on her. Then he looked back down. "You should be afraid, Edith Marsh," he said, and the rasp had gone out of his voice and left something quieter and far more dangerous. "But not of me." He stepped past her toward a stack of split driftwood, and his words drifted back over his shoulder and hit her harder than the wind. "Your husband didn't drown by accident." Edith's breath caught hard in her chest. She spun on the step. "What did you say?" Silas turned to face her. "The morning Thomas Marsh went down," he said, "I was on this rock with my glass on the water, the way I am every dawn. There was no storm when those 4 boats put out. The storm came up after fast, the kind every man on this coast can read coming an hour off. No master worth his salt sends boats out into that window, but Corwin Fitch did. He sent them because he had a schedule to keep and cargo coming up from the banks that he meant to land in the dark and off the books, and your Thomas and the others were sent out to run interference so the revenue men would be looking the wrong way. The sea took them for it." "No," Edith said. Her knees had gone to water and she gripped the cold iron rail. "No, Thomas drowned. They all drowned. Everyone says. Everyone says you turned them over, you took their boats down." Silas shook his head slowly, and for the first time there was no anger in him at all, only a great weariness. "I rowed out," he said. "When I saw the squall take them, I put my own dory in the water and I rowed into it, and I pulled 2 men out before the cold finished them, and I went back for the others and there was nothing left to pull. 2 lived because of me. And when it was done and the village wanted someone to hate for it, Fitch gave them me. The keeper. The scarred man on the rock who's good for nothing but frightening children. It was a clean trade for him. He kept his secret and I kept the blame. And one of the men I saved swore in front of the constable that I'd run them aground on purpose, because Fitch owned that man's debt too." Tears stood hot in Edith's eyes, and behind them, slowly, something turned. For 8 months she had hated the sea for taking Thomas. She had stood on the headland and cursed the water. But it had not been the water. It had been a man in a wool coat with a ledger, who had sent 4 husbands out into a death he could read coming, to cover a crime, and who now stood in her parlor every fortnight and offered her his condolences and his arithmetic. The grief she'd carried like a stone went suddenly white and sharp as a gutting knife. She looked up at the keeper through the blur, and her mind was clearer than it had been since the empty coffin. "Can you prove it?" she said. Her voice cracked and then went hard. Silas was quiet a moment. He said at last, "I can. Will you help me then? Not just the birth, all of it. Will you help me bury Corwin Fitch?" Silas Crow looked at the fierce, weeping, upright woman standing on his steps in the rising wind. A woman who had climbed across a drowning causeway and looked at his ruined face and seen a man, and he felt something he had thought long dead stir to life under his breastbone. For years he had cared for nothing but the lamp and the bird and the cruel comfort of being left alone. "I don't want a third of your catch, Edith," he said. He came back to her and reached out one scarred hand, and stopped just short of her shoulder. "But I'll come down off this rock, and we'll give Mr. Fitch something to be afraid of that he can't buy his way out of." The crossing back at slack tide was its own kind of trial, but when Silas Crow's boots came down on the planks of Penhallow's wharf the next morning, the change in the air was a thing you could feel on your skin. Word ran through the village ahead of him like a spark down a fuse. The monster had come off his rock. He came with his oilskins and his tools and a sea chest, and the one-eyed gull wheeling and shrieking overhead, and he set to work on Edith Marsh's neglected boat with a silent, terrible competence that drew watchers to every cottage window. For the next 3 weeks the wharf became the most watched stretch of plank in the county. Silas recaulked the seams and re-rigged the mast and spliced new line where the old had rotted, and his big scarred hands moved with a care that did not match the stories at all. Edith worked beside him from before dawn, mending sail and gear, baking bread that she carried down in a cloth, keeping the ledgers of what they'd need and what they had, which was little. She had braced herself for a brute. What she got was stranger and gentler. When Silas hauled up a stray pollock in his bait net, he split it and cooked it on a little iron pan on the wharf and gave her the better half without a word. In the long blue evenings he sat on an overturned crate and carved, slow and absorbed, shaping cork and pine into net floats, and once, when he thought she wasn't watching, into the small, rough figure of a gull. And every day, without fail, the one-eyed bird came shrieking down to perch on the boat's gunwale, and Silas fed it from his hand, and the village children dared each other to creep close enough to see the monster's familiar take fish from the monster's fingers. And slowly, one by one, they stopped running. He never spoke of the fire that had marked him, and she never asked. And the silence between them changed week by week from something tense and watchful into something warm. The easy quiet of two people who had each been alone too long and had stopped, at last, being alone. Corwin Fitch watched all of this from the high window of his cannery with a face like a closing trap. He had expected to find Edith Marsh starved and frozen, and ready to make her mark on his deed of sale by Candlemas. Instead, his constable brought him word that the widow's boat was sound and rigged, that the scarred keeper had quartered himself on the wharf like a guard dog, and worse, that the village was beginning to talk, beginning to wonder, beginning to look at the keeper and see a man and look at the cannery and see something else. Fitch had built his whole kingdom on what people believed, and belief, he understood, was a tide that could turn. So he chose not to wait for it. On a gray Thursday with the smell of snow and the wind, Corwin Fitch came down the lane to the wharf, and he did not come alone. He brought his constable, sweating and unhappy, and he brought two harbor toughs up from the cannery floor, slab-shouldered men with billy clubs and dead eyes, led by a brawler named Boyd Vane, who was known along the whole coast for breaking the fingers of men who fished where Fitch said they shouldn't. Edith stepped out onto the wharf with Thomas's old fowling piece broken open over her arm, and she snapped it shut. She kept the barrels pointed at the planks, but her knuckles were white. "Mrs. Marsh," Fitch called, stopping a careful distance off, his smile thin and his eyes flicking over the rigged boat. "I see you found yourself some charity." He nodded at Silas, who had set down his marlinspike and was watching with his arms loose at his sides. "But charity won't pay the winter quota. The bank's deadline stands. The berth reverts to the cannery at noon and the cottage with it. I paid the interest, Mr. Fitch," Edith said, and her voice rang sharp and clear off the water so that the gathering villagers could hear every word. "Prute witnessed it. You've no lawful claim, and you know it." Fitch's smile curdled. "Out here, Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I am the harbor master and I am the law of this wharf, and I say your husband's debt forfeits this berth today. Now you can walk off it on your own feet, or my men can carry you." Boyd Vane took a step forward, hefting his club. He did not take a second step. Silas Crow moved between Edith and the toughs, unhurried, and the very size of him in the narrow space stopped them. But it was not his hands he raised. It was a flat tin case, salt-stained and bound in oilcloth, which he held up so the whole crowd could see it. "You all know me," Silas said, and his scraped voice carried down the wharf and silenced even the gulls. "You've called me monster 8 years. You let Corwin Fitch tell you I ran 4 of your men onto the rocks." He turned the case in his scarred hand. "I kept the keeper's log, the way the service requires. Every vessel that passes the light, every hour, every change of weather, set down in my own hand and witnessed by the tide itself." He flipped it open. "The morning Thomas Marsh and the others drowned, I logged 4 boats put out of this harbor a full hour before any squall, on a falling glass that every man here can read. And I logged the cargo schooner that Corwin Fitch ran up the back channel that same dawn, unflagged, while his men were sent out front to draw the revenue cutter off her scent. It's all here. Dates, times, the schooner's name." A low sound went through the crowd, a sound like a wave drawing back over shingle. Fitch's face had gone the color of tallow. "Lies," he spat, "the ravings of a madman on a rock. Who'll take the word of a monster over mine?" And then a thin voice spoke up from the back of the crowd. It was N. Tilly, a stooped, gray fisherman, one of the 2 men the keeper had pulled living from that water 8 years before, and he was weeping as he pushed to the front. "It's no lie," he said, and his voice shook, but it did not stop. "God forgive me, it's no lie. Crow pulled me out of that sea with his own hands, and the burns on him he took dragging Sam Petrie clear of a burning lamp oil that went up in the dory. And Fitch came to me after when I was abed and ruined, and he held my debt over me, and he made me swear in front of Constable Hatch that the keeper did it a purpose. I've carried it 8 years. I can't carry it another hour." The villagers turned slowly, the way a single great animal turns, and they looked at Corwin Fitch. Fitch saw the tide go out from under him all at once. He wheeled toward his constable. "Arrest the keeper," he hissed. "Arrest the widow seditious, the both of them." But Reuben Hatch did not move, because Reuben Hatch had heard Tilly too and was looking at his own boots with the face of a man doing 8 years of arithmetic. And it was then, down the frozen lane, that the sound of horses came, and a small column of riders in dark government blue came around the cannery wall, led by a hard-eyed man with a revenue service badge bright on his coat. Edith looked at Sela's, the gun forgotten in her hands. "Who are they?" she breathed. Sela's lowered the tin case. "3 weeks back," he said quietly, "I gave a passing mail packet a letter for the collector of customs at Portland. Told him a keeper had 8 years of logs showing a smuggling run, and a man drowned to cover it. The Revenue Service has long memories for unflagged schooners, Edith. They've been wanting a reason to come to Penhallow for a long while." Corwin Fitch made one last desperate lunge toward his horse, and found himself looking down the twin barrels of Edith Marsh's gun, her hands no longer shaking at all. "Don't," she said, her voice colder than the wind off the water. He stopped. And then the revenue men were among them, and the tin logbook passed into the hands of the man with the badge, and Tilly said it all again before witnesses, and Boyd Vane, who had not signed on to fight the law, dropped his club in the mud and stepped well back with his palms out. Within the hour Corwin Fitch was in irons in his own cannery yard, his ledger seized, his thin protests drowned by the murmur of the village he had owned for 20 years and would never own again. The log Silas had kept so faithfully on his lonely rock, and the confession of the man he'd saved, were more than enough to see the harbor master answer for fraud and for 4 deaths in a federal court. As the riders led him away down the lane, the first slow flakes of the season's snow began to fall, settling soft and clean over the mud, and the wharf, and the upturned faces of people learning all at once that they had hated the wrong man for 8 years. Edith broke open the gun and set it down and crossed the wharf to where Silas stood, and only then did she see the dark stain spreading at his sleeve where Boyd Vane's club had caught his forearm in the first scuffle. "You're hurt," she said, her hands hovering over the torn oilskin. "It's nothing," Silas grunted, though he winced as she peeled the fabric back. "Had worse off an angry conger eel." She let out a breath that was half a sob and half a laugh and looked up at him, and the great staggering truth of what he had done settled over her. He had come down off his rock. He had handed 8 years of his own vindication to the government and stood up before the whole village that despised him and bled, to save the home and the name of a woman he'd known 3 weeks. She reached up, her cold hands warm against him, and laid them on his face, and she did not touch the whole side. Her fingers traced the gleaming, ruined skin of the burns, gently, the way you touch something precious. Silas stiffened and tried to pull back, the old terror of disgust rising in him. "Don't," Edith whispered, stepping closer, closing the last of the gap. "Don't hide from me." His eyes shone with something he had not let himself feel in years. "Edith," he said, "I'm a ruined man." "You are the best man I have ever known," she said fiercely, and the snow came down around them in the gathering dusk, and out on the rock the great lamp began its slow, patient blinking, on and off, throwing its light across the water to bring the village's boats safely home, the way it always had, the way the man they'd called a monster had kept it burning every single night of the 8 years they'd spent hatting him. The one-eyed gull came shrieking down out of the snow and landed on the gunwale beside them, and Silas crow, without quite knowing he did it, reached into his coat and fed it from his hand. And for the first time in his long, cold life, the keeper of Penhallow Light understood that he had finally, after all the years on his rock, come home.